allow me to speak with the Lord for a moment. Blessed Lord our God, I thank you for giving us once again an opportunity to engage with the words you left behind. Lord, I pray that you will give me the words to speak and give us all ears to hear and minds to understand. And above all, Lord, give us hearts that are willing to change and willing to be transformed and willing to be brought into your likeness. Help us, Lord, to reflect your love and your mercy in the world. And I pray this all b'Shem Yeshua. Amen. Well, I think I'm calling this Galatians part 12, the conclusion. I think we're finally finishing this. When I launched this Galatians series, it was all the way back in August, actually, and it was during the Torah portion we call Re'eh, see. Re'eh put before us the choice between blessing and curse. I set before you this day a blessing and curse. Re'eh looks actually to a future where the children of Israel would live in the blessings of unity and harmony with one another and with God, living in his blessing. And it was at that point where we jumped off into this epistle to the Galatians, which also has as its thrust a theme of looking to a way that we can live in unity and harmony together as believers. So when I started this is what I said. I said the interpretation of the epistle to the Galatians is very controversial. Much of Christianity, has interpreted it one way for millennia, and oddly enough, mainstream Judaism has agreed with their interpretation. Conventional interpretation is that Paul launched a new religion with his epistles, rejecting Judaism and creating Christianity. A large part of the church holds this understanding, and a large part of rabbinic Judaism agrees that Paul innovated a new religion of the Gentiles, worshiping the Gentile God called Jesus. But when read in context, Galatians holds very clear lessons for Messianic Jewish congregations today. My intent in this series is to explore the teaching of Paul in its history and social context in the light of the risen Messiah, then compare the historical setting with the modern setting and see how Galatians informs our theological position. That's what I said back then when we started. So I hope we've come to that. I also gave a caveat when we started, that we would be looking at Paul in a context that does not agree with the generally accepted view of Paul. I also said at that time that it may represent for many a paradigm shift, and I warned that paradigm shifts are often very uncomfortable. The accepted view is that Paul may have been a Jewish Pharisee before, but his encounter with Yeshua on the road to Damascus was a complete conversion to a new religion called Christianity, which subsumes and replaces Judaism. But this view simply is not consistent with the scriptures and the records of Paul's words and actions. Therefore, our approach was to look at Paul contextually. We briefly looked at the setting of the first century, especially as regards to the Jewish people who at the time were the only people on earth that were worshiping the one true God. We looked at both the Holy Land and the Jewish diaspora. We looked at the political situation in the Promised Land and the situation in the various Roman provinces. When all was said and done, we noted that Paul never abandoned his Jewish practice. And we also noted that he never demanded that Gentiles coming to faith had to take on Jewish practice in order to be saved. We also saw that all of Paul's arguments in Galatians, and indeed in his other letters also, were not arguments against Judaism, but arguments from within Judaism. Paul had a significant challenge before him in the first century: to promote table fellowship between newly converted former pagans and newly enlightened traditional Jews. This was a challenge because halakhic rules in the Jewish culture of the time forbade them to share table fellowship with Gentiles. But now, at that time, made clean by faith in Yeshua, God's flocks could begin to live together in unity. As Yeshua said in John chapter 10, verse 16, I have other sheep that are not from this fold. Those I also must lead, and they will listen to my voice. So there shall be one flock and one shepherd. So let's see if we can close out this series today in its 12th part. This series has been a look at the epistle of Galatians through Messianic Jewish eyes. And these are all recorded. You can all get to them on our website. If you're just joining us or if you've missed a bunch of them, please, by all means, go back. You may have to search for them a little bit, but go back to August and you'll begin to see. This is the 12th part, so there's 11 before us. When I decided to offer this series, I knew full well that in the grand scheme of biblical interpretation, I am really not much. I'll put it this way. I'm like a gnat hanging on the tip of the tail of the Clydesdale that is Pauline scholarship. Many learned and meticulous scholars have given the world their interpretation of Paul, and there's much in it of value. They have given us a great deal to think about. Perhaps no biblical figure has received as much ink, and certainly no biblical author has had as much of an influence on the course of human civilization as the one who is known for all eternity as Paul, at least from the perspective of the dominant paradigm of Pauline interpretation, that is. But I offered this series nonetheless because it is clear that the dominant approach to Paul seems quite a bit different from the Paul that is depicted in the scriptures, and I wanted to bring that out to us. I quote from a man named Timothy Gombis, who wrote in an article in the journal Christianity Today in 2011, the misconception about Paul with the longest historical pedigree is that he was anti-Jewish. And listen, we're living in a time in God's history when being anti-Jewish is a growing trend across the world. It's easy to see how the sons of Ishmael might be that way. We know the history. We're used to that. But what is much harder to swallow is how many Christians are buying into the anti-Zionist, anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish narrative. Or if they are not compliant in such lies, they are just simply silent regarding the whole issue. I've recently had a retired pastor tell me that in his recent experience in churches in this very town, been largely silent regarding Israel and the worldwide threat to the Jewish people. I feel that both the buying into the falsehoods as well as the silence can be traced directly to this long pedigreed misconception that Timothy Gombis talks about. This sermon series was not only meant to address how the letter to Galatians applies to modern Messianic Jewish synagogues, but it was also meant to be a voice proclaiming the falsehood of Paul's alleged anti-Jewish teaching. So with all that said, I want to go into now just a summary of the key messages from this series that I've given thus far. And then I want to try to do a little bit of what I said I was going to do. Compare the historical setting with the modern setting and see how Galatians informs our theological position. So here are some of the key take-home messages. Paul remained a Jew. Paul maintained his Jewishness right up to the end. Even after his Damascus Road encounter, he still kept Shabbat. He still made pilgrimage to Jerusalem at the Moedim. He still participated in temple offerings, and he still fasted at Yom Kippur. He declared himself to be a Pharisee in the present tense. Attending synagogue on the Shabbat was his typical lifestyle. And I noted that by my calculations in Acts alone, that's over 80 times. He hurried to make it to Jerusalem for pilgrimage festivals. He kept the fast of Yom Kippur while traveling on a boat. He funded and participated in the fulfillment of Nazirite vows on at least 2 occasions, according to the strict halakha of the time. Paul declared himself blameless as to the righteousness of the Torah. In other words, the traditional approach to Torah. In Acts 24:14, he says, I worship the God of our fathers as a follower of the way, which they call a sect, believing all things according to the Torah and the things having been written in the prophets. Paul clearly did not see a contradiction between the revelation of Yeshua and his ancestral religion, which predicted the Messiah in the first place. He saw his encounter with Yeshua as the fulfillment of the promise that God made to the Jewish people of a Messiah. Paul announced the Messiah, which had been hoped for by the prophets, according to the scriptures. And let's not forget that Messiah Yeshua said to his Jewish audience in Israel that as long as the sun and stars remain, not the tiniest mark of the Torah will pass away until all things are accomplished. Paul saw his mission as part of the fulfillment of the promises of the Tanakh, that is, the Torah, the prophets, and the writings, which we must note have not all come to fruition yet. All things have not been accomplished yet. So Paul stated you. Another key take-home point. Paul emphasized believers' identities. Paul emphasized the importance of retaining one's identity when coming to faith in Yeshua. If you were called while circumcised, remain circumcised. If called while uncircumcised, remain so. It's clear from Paul's letters, as well as from the book of Acts, that within the unified body of Messiah, there was the ecclesia of the circumcision and the ecclesia of the uncircumcision. Not 2 covenants, 1 covenant. Okay, just to be clear. Not 2 bodies, 1 body. Again, just to be clear. But with clear identities. Otherwise, the promises God made to the Jewish people would be made void if they disappeared into anonymity. The leaders of the early ecclesia did not want Gentiles to become Jews, nor did they want Jews to become Gentiles. One new man referred to salvational status, not a negation of identity. Nor does identity alone grant salvation. There is room in the good news for both Jews and Gentiles, and neither has to give up their national identity. But they do have to share fellowship in peace and harmony. That is a requirement. Okay, another take-home lesson. Paul answered a call he did not convert. On the road to Damascus, Paul met the Jewish Messiah. He also met him while praying in the temple at Jerusalem. Paul, in describing his calling, used language which paralleled Jeremiah's language. Jeremiah was called to be the prophet to the nations. Paul said that God had set him apart from birth, called him by grace, revealed his son to Paul, so that he could preach him among the Gentiles. This is parallel to the scriptures in Jeremiah chapter 1, verses 4 and 5, and a fulfillment of Jeremiah 4:2, if you want to look those up later, that connects directly to the Abrahamic promise of all nations blessing themselves in him. The connection of Paul's use of circumcision and uncircumcision can also be found in Jeremiah, linked to Jeremiah 9, verses 24 through 26. In short, Damascus was a calling completely within Jewish context rather than a conversion to something else. Another take-home lesson. Paul's letter to the Galatians is a polemic against legalism of works of the law. Legalism was the problem that slipped into the assemblies of Galatia. A false doctrine that said Gentiles had to become circumcised and keep certain works of the law in order to be made right with God. We noted how the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls shed light on this enigmatic phrase, works of the law, miksat maaseh Torah. and allowed us to understand more clearly the source of this false doctrine. We also noted how the caves at Qumran preserve for us an Essene calendar that helps to make sense of Paul's admonition regarding days and times and seasons and years. Paul was addressing an internal debate about calendar. In short, this treasure trove of documents in the caves at Qumran helped us to see how incredibly consistent Paul's polemic against legalism is. It does not require us to interpret part of his argument in the context of Torah and then another part in the context of pagan festivals, as some do. Instead, the Dead Sea Scrolls have shown us that there is a comprehensive and foundation from which these legalizers were coming and were arguing. Paul also, this is another major take-home. Paul taught of the primacy of faith in Yeshua over all else. While Paul emphasized the importance of identity, he did not teach that identity saved anyone. Both Jew and Gentile have one and the same path to justification in the final judgment. That is, by faith in the atoning death, the life-giving resurrection, and the heavenly ascension of Yeshua, who now acts as our unbeatable defense attorney at Judgment Day. From his perspective, and in that heavenly courtroom, Yeshua's that is, there is neither Jew nor Gentile, man or woman, slave or free. All are simply a soul in Yeshua's flock, which he defends, period. And as an aside, for anyone who is listening and has not yet accepted Yeshua, I'll ask you this. You might want to ask yourself, do you really want to go to the heavenly court on the day after your last day on this earth and act as your own attorney? It is ill-advised in mere human courts to act as your own attorney. How much more in the presence of the true judge? Just think about it. You don't know the law as well as the judge who gave it. You don't even know the law as well as Hasatan, who is your accuser in this court. But my defense attorney says this: take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Just a point to consider for those of you who maybe have not considered Yeshua in that way. Back to what we are doing here. Paul displayed his Ivy League education in the use of midrashic techniques. That's another thing I'd like you to take home from this series. We saw that midrash is central to the Jewish mindset. So this Jewish mindset to approach looking at scriptures can be important. Midrash is a form of scriptural interpretation, which, and I'll quote from what I read before from that definition of midrash. It responds to contemporary problems and crafts new stories, making connections between new Jewish realities and the unchanging biblical text. For Paul, in Galatians, the new reality was that Gentiles who were formerly far off had been brought near. The Jerusalem Council, recorded for us in Acts 15, had made it abundantly clear that Gentiles did not need to convert to Judaism, nor were they held accountable to the Mosaic law. Now, Paul faced a problem of false brothers teaching the opposite. Thus, he used the allegory of Sarah and Hagar to show that the legalizers were calling the new Gentile believers into slavery, not freedom. All to make this dramatic declaration at the end of his midrash from the unchanging biblical text. He said, "Cast out the bondwoman." That was the foundation on the unchanging text. He was not using the allegory to throw out the Torah. And I also quoted in that sermon, if you will remember, my professor and longtime leader in the Messianic Jewish movement, Dr. John Fisher. He said this: There is a general rule or principle in hermeneutics of any kind that you don't base your total understanding of a theme or a key teaching, or in this case a doctrine, on allegory. An allegory is simply a vivid illustration of a doctrine or of a theme or of a principle. It is a method of argumentation. And in fact, it is a very rabbinic one at that. So remember that take home. Don't base your doctrine on allegory. Paul also contrasted freedom with bondage. We noted that the whole sweep of the biblical narrative from Genesis to Revelation is focused on our journey towards spiritual freedom. The central foundational story of the Jewish people is the story of the Exodus, leaving the bonds of slavery. Paul teaches us that Yeshua set us free for the sake of this central theme of the Bible, for freedom. You were made free for the sake of freedom. The free person receives the Holy Spirit, which leads him or her in their walk in life, their own exodus, leaving the bond of what Paul calls the flesh. But rather than thinking of the flesh as sensual pleasures or lust, we should actually think of the fleshly desires as ordinary human inclinations. When you hear that flesh from now on, think about that. Ordinary human inclinations. Often our mind goes to lust and sensual things, but it's ordinary human inclination. This contrast of the spiritual with the flesh was epitomized in the legalistic requirement of circumcision of Gentiles as a false path to salvation. Remember, Paul said, "You were running a good race. Who cut into you?" And I commented on how clever his wording is. But Paul also defends himself in that he did not say that Jews should not continue to practice circumcision. He said, "If I still preach circumcision, why am I still being persecuted?" Remember, he circumcised Timothy, whose mother was Jewish, but he did not compel Titus to be circumcised. Paul's freedom in Messiah never suppresses identity. Another take-home lesson, very important one. Legalism inevitably leads to conflict. The need for this letter arose from the change in the hearts of the congregants in the Galatian assemblies. Paul's heart was broken when he heard the change. The infection of the legalistic doctrine brought with it strife and contentions and jealousy. Seeking to use our actions to get right with God means that it will not be long before someone starts thinking, "I'm more right than you because I do this and you don't." This is the biting and devouring that consumed the assemblies. The striving and contention over, as it says in Titus 3:9, foolish controversies and genealogies and strife and disputes about Torah, for they are unprofitable and useless. That's what was causing this strife. Living under the grace of God does not leave room for these things. But the moment we turn from grace to works, grace leaves the room. So those were some of the key things I wanted you to take home. How does the historical context of Galatians relate to the context of today? As I was writing this, it got way too big. So I pared it down. Let's think of it in terms of differences and similarities. We'll start this comparison. Here's a difference. Relative proportions. I'll say it that way. In the diaspora world of the far-flung Greco-Roman Empire, the only places to assemble and learn about the one true God was the synagogue. Wherever you were on earth, at that time, that's the only place that the one true God was being worshipped. The journeys of Paul and the apostles engaged Jews living in the diaspora communities. This is how Gentiles first came in contact with the message of the good news, because they had already been attracted to these synagogues. At the time, there were no other options for Gentiles at the time of the writing of these things. They could only go to a synagogue to hear the revelation of God. The only other things available to them were pagan temples. This is not the case today. The grand sweep of history has produced what many call the church age. The believers in the Messiah are overwhelmingly now Gentile, and they gather in churches to worship Yeshua. In those days, it was the opposite. The overwhelming majority were Jews, and they gathered in synagogues. Today, it's quite the opposite. In the days of Yeshua, all the apostles and the first adherents to the way were all Jewish. The difficult challenge they had was to determine what to do with the Gentiles that were coming to follow Yeshua. Here in modern times, and as a result of the typical teaching for almost 2,000 years of Paul, Christianity does not know what to do with practicing Jews that believe in Jesus. It's literally quite the opposite of what was the case back then. The interpretation of Paul and his letters like Galatians as anti-Torah and anti-Jewish have formed a barrier to Jews coming to faith in Messiah in our times. So the rise of the Messianic Jewish synagogue presents a wonderful opportunity to bridge that gap. Not only are Jewish believers in Yeshua a part of the greater body of Messiah with their Gentile brothers and sisters, but they are also the physical descendants of the sons of Jacob. The Messianic Jewish synagogue is therefore a place where the one new man is seen right here before our eyes every single week. It's a place where Jews can worship in a Jewish space, together with Gentiles who have not had the opportunity to experience something like this, something which, though not exactly like it, does in fact resemble first century assemblies of believers in the communities of Asia Minor. But it has its challenges. So here's a similarity between then and now. The problem of legalism still exists today. Just like in the days of Paul, there are theologies today that promote legalism for Gentiles, which still creep into assemblies. Today, such theologies go by names like one law, two house, Ephraimite, and sacred name, and they tend to command the universal acceptance and observance of what they call Torah upon all Gentiles. Just to make things clear, CBSS does not subscribe to these theologies. But the commands that these theologies present seem to focus on a very limited portion of the Torah, which are generally clear identity markers given to the nation of Israel when they left Egypt, things like dietary laws and the Moedim and the Shabbat and tzitzits and so forth. While there are many errors associated with these theologies, the main one to focus on is that they are contradicted by the teachings of the letter of Galatians. It contradicts the teaching of Acts 15 when they go to command and say that all Gentiles must do these things. That's when they run into this contradiction. Other letters show this too, Romans and Ephesians and Colossians. Salvation comes by faith alone in Yeshua, not, as we said in the sermon series, Yeshua plus. It is Yeshua alone. And we got to remember that the Torah is much more complete and full than these theologies tend to give it credit for. The Torah is much more than kosher, more than all of those things, much more than Moedim. It is the revelation of God, and every aspect of it reflects a direction toward the revelation of Messiah Yeshua. As we have seen in this series on Galatians, what is most important for believers is to live in peace and unity without strife. It is much more than just keeping a few commandments. It's displaying what our Messiah called the weightier matters of the law, and what Paul called the fruits of the Spirit. He said, against which there is no law. This is the universal aspect of the revelation at Mount Sinai. Now, just because CBSS does not agree with these theologies, the one law, etc., is not saying that we believe there are two laws. one for Jews and one for Gentiles. The problem comes from the legalistic demands of these theologies. Many Gentiles find their spiritual home in Messianic synagogues like CBS in response to a call from the Lord. Many non-Jews come to the Messianic Jewish fold with the desire of knowing the Lord through the Jewishness of the Scriptures and in the ancient way of life, which was Yeshua's own culture and heritage, and has been preserved by the Jewish people. Places like Beth Shalom are welcoming and loving, and would not attain to what we are if we were just uniformly Jewish or just uniformly Gentile. In fact, it is the unity of Jew and Gentile in Messiah, in spite of our cultural diversity, if you like that term, which glorifies God in the body of Messiah as the one new man, which you find in Ephesians 2:15. It's the fact that we are together that glorifies God. In our view, therefore, it is wrong to admonish and pressure Gentile believers to universally think they have to observe all the aspects of the Torah in the way that Jewish believers do, or, and I add this, do not. At the same time, we welcome Gentiles to take on a biblical lifestyle that they feel spiritually called to. That's incredibly important, the spiritual calling. And that's why Beth Shalom is so beautiful. Let's go to another difference. Jewish practice and faith in Yeshua. Having seen a pitfall for Gentile believers, let's talk about one for Jewish believers. It's kind of another form of legalism in a way. One that instead of saying thou shalt, it says thou shalt not. Interpreting Paul as being against Judaism has led some to teach Jewish believers that they must not observe Torah commandments. But the apostles and the earliest followers in the Holy Land were all Jews and maintained their Jewish practice. They just did it now in the light of Messiah. Here, I'll quote to you something from one who is called one of the early church fathers, Irenaeus. This comes from something he wrote in the 2nd century called Against Heresies. Irenaeus was a disciple whose teacher had been a student of the Apostle John. So he's a lot closer to that time than we are. Here's what he said in his book Against Heresies. They themselves continued in the ancient observances. The apostles scrupulously acted in accord with the dispensation of the Mosaic law. That's what someone who was as close to a witness as we have said. The effectiveness of the interpretation of Paul as anti-Jewish has left this, what I just read you, as a foreign idea to most Christians. They have not been taught that. In fact, that's what's missing when Yeshua is taken out of his context, is the depth and the fullness of the teaching. So as a result, we have a big difference between the first century and today. Things like reading from the Torah and ancient daily prayers have been absent from Christian worship for millennia. There are many Jewish people that are in churches today living and worshiping according to the traditions of the church, and they are not aware of the Jewishness of the early church. A recent Pew study, a research study in 2015, for the first time in 2015, they included questions about Jewish ethnicity, asking people attending churches, do you have a Jewish parent or two parents or a grandparent who is Jewish? And the results were kind of astounding. Fully 800,000 people in evangelical Christianity in America alone are ethnically Jewish. But because of the separation of the Jewish heritage of our faith, they no longer express any Jewish lifestyle or form of worship. The Jewish identity has been hidden and suppressed in those places. Once again, the Messianic Jewish congregation is the ray of hope. Here is a place where the Jewish believer can worship the God of Israel in the light of Yeshua and restore their Jewishness, which was suppressed in other places that they have worshiped. Not that their Christian faith was wrong. They indeed accept Yeshua as the Lord and Savior, but the Messianic synagogue can offer a place to touch their heritage again. That's how it was for me. That's why I'm so enthusiastic about Messianic Jewish synagogues. So let me just bring in some conclusory remarks here. We've talked about a great many things. We've challenged paradigms. We've stretched things. We've made statements I hope are bold. And we've noted the modern pitfalls that are out there for both Gentile believers and Jewish believers. Much of it comes from this great misunderstanding of the writings of Paul. So I'd like to leave us with one more thought as we close the book of Galatians series. Even though these misinterpretations of Paul have been in place for millennia, we must not participate in something I call church bashing. We can't do that. Nor can we participate in belittling of Judaism for somehow missing their Messiah. Judaism was the faith of our Messiah. That's not what we're called to. We're not called to church bash or synagogue bash. We at CBSS stand on a bridge which has its one abutment anchored on the bank of Judaism and its other abutment firmly anchored on the bank of Christianity. Yeshua and his apostles built this bridge when they took the message of Yeshua across the Jordan River. But not many today even know the bridge is there. We stand at a place which can promote unity and understanding for those that stand on each of those banks. We have the opportunity to promote shalom and reconciliation between Christians and Jews because we have understanding of both sides. And the motivation for this must be because we love all those that stand on both shores of the river. That's what we're commanded. We are, in fact, in the perfect position to address the issues of the day. We can address the source of church anti-Semitism. We can address the source of Jewish misunderstanding of Jesus. We can stand on the common ground where Yeshua walked. We live on the common ground that Paul taught about. We follow the master Jewish rabbi who is far more than any rabbi before or since. We follow the Jewish head of a yeshiva whose chosen students, the apostles. The man who became the Savior of the world and has been worshipped by billions of Gentiles across the globe for almost 2,000 years. We stand in commonality with them. But we can only do that if we have our house in order. So we must have unity. We must have mutual love. We must have mutual respect. We must not fall prey to the hazards of disunity that the letter of Galatians warned against. We must be gardens full of trees that bring forth the fruit of the Spirit. We must be a house full of servants that bear each other's burdens. Then our unity of spirit in the bonds of peace will stand as a shining witness to all who visit, that they might come to know the truth of the words of the Haftorah that Yeshua chanted in the synagogue those 2,000 years ago. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to set free those who are oppressed, and to proclaim the favorable year of the Lord. This is a proclamation from a synagogue in Nazareth that echoed across the entire globe, and it is still reverberating today. And it's my prayer that that same sound will be heard, reverberating loud and clear from the walls of Congregation Beth Shalom. Let's go to the Lord in prayer. Blessed Lord our God, our Father in heaven, You blessed us with the words you left behind. You blessed us greatly by giving us Messiah Yeshua. And you have blessed us each personally by giving us this wonderful place, this wonderful flock to be a part of, to stand together, no matter what our background, and to lift up pure worship and pure praises to you. Lord, I pray that you will help us to reflect that love to all who enter, to all who we encounter, and to be a place standing on a bridge where we can reach two sides of the shore and help to open eyes and to bring peace to others. And I pray this all, B'Shem Yeshua. Amen.